Hey, 8th graders, how are you? This is part 3 of 8 lessons that are going to be dealing with issues that we will be debating. Remember, you should be keeping a record of where you stand on each issue. Today, we're going to be talking about crime and punishment issues, namely capital punishment and gun control. Let's get right into it. So, we're going to look at capital punishment first. And the question that we will be debating is, should U.S. government still allow the use of capital punishment? On one side, you have the conservative side to the right, the affirmative, yes, we should still allow it, who argue that capital punishment isn't just given to any criminal, it's given to severe criminals who do horrible things to many people, who commit the worst of crimes and have to receive the hardest measure of justice. People like Ted Bundy on top and John Wayne Gacy, who were serial killers and killed and tortured people. They both received capital punishment, and advocates for this say that that was justice and that they deserved it. The negative, the no side by the liberals, can be seen, summed up in this little blurb I found on a site. It says, "Why do we kill people who kill people to show killing people is wrong?" That capital punishment is at worst hypocritical, and at best hypocritical, and at worst a violation of natural rights. So let's explore it. A little bit more background. Capital punishment is the government executing legally authorized killing of a person as punishment for a crime. Capital punishment is currently in the U.S. in 5 different forms, including electrocution, usually by the electric chair, a firing squad, which, if it were used, would usually be in a military situation, a gas chamber, which was carried out in California for a number of years, but is, even though it's legal, isn't really used anymore. Hanging is still a legal form of execution. And lastly, lethal injection, which is the most commonly used in the U.S. today, which involves the person as punishment being injected with a series of medicines that first paralyze them and then shut down their organs. The U.S. government has left it to the states, for the most part, to decide whether or whether not to allow capital punishment. Currently, 30 states allow it. 20 states plus D.C. do not. It is still federally allowed, but it is limited in what type of cases it can be used. So let's go to the affirmative, the conservative view that yes, we should still allow the use of capital punishment. One argument is that it's legal and effective. It is ultimately legal and effective, and it works as it in carrying out justice. They'll point out that the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld the death penalty as being constitutional multiple times. It has been before many different courts across many different generations, and the court has upheld that capital punishment is constitutional. The legal forms of execution are each designed to be quick and as painless as possible. Death is almost instantaneous, which when you look at people like John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy, the death for the people that they killed was not, and was often involved a good deal of suffering. So they argue that they're being treated with mercy. They also point out that the advances in forensic science, like DNA evidence, have made it next to impossible for an innocent person to be convicted by a jury of 12 people unanimously, and also that the right of appeal makes sure that even if an innocent person was convicted, that they're not going to be executed because they have the right to multiple appeals before their sentence is ultimately carried out. So there's many filters in place in the justice system to make sure that if a person is going to receive this type of punishment, that they have that they are most definitely guilty. They argue that it is the ultimate deterrent for the ultimate crime. They will argue that committing murder, knowing that committing murder will result in your own death, will make people think twice about a crime. That, if I kill this person, that I also will die, it might be something that will not lead people down to the way of thinking that they're going to do this most hideous of crimes. They also argue that the only way to guarantee that a murderer will never kill again is to carry out a death sentence. Life imprisonment isn't usually always life. People can be paroled. People can be let out on good behavior. People can even escape. But the one way to guarantee that they won't kill again is to carry out a death sentence. And they've proven by doing it once, or in the case of the people before, many times, that they're highly likely to do it again. And the death penalty is the only proven way to secure that the most dangerous and inhuman people who do horrible things can no longer be a threat to our society. People like, a John Wayne Gacy who preyed on children, or Ted Bundy who killed, by some accounts, up to 100 women. They are a danger to our society at large. So to remove that danger, you should remove that person. And prison alone isn't enough. And they also argue that without the death penalty, in that ultimate measure of justice, people will be more likely to take the law in their own hands. Lastly, conservatives argue that murder is the ultimate crime. It deserves the ultimate measure of justice. Is it justice for a murderer to live, to breathe, to think, to eat, to dream, when their victim will never do those things? They argue that a life sentence doesn't fit the crime for murder. People become institutionalized. Prison becomes their new normal. And life in prison does have the comforts of being alive. You can make friends. You can have visitors. You can watch TV, go on the internet. The victim can't do any of those things. Their life is over. Their life is done. And also it includes the possibility of parole, where eventually a person who committed this hideous crime may eventually get out. Even if they don't kill again, the fact that they could have freedom after doing that type of a crime is, many people would argue, injustice. They also would argue that a murder results in more than just the death of one victim. One could argue that in many ways, many people are murdered by one murder, that their lives are never the same, that their lives before that are destroyed. Murder destroys families. It destroys communities. It is the most vile and powerful in its impact of crimes. And they would argue that giving the death penalty provides closure to victims' families. They would argue that there's so much in our system that is designed to protect the criminal, to protect the guilty, that we should be looking to protect the victims and their loved ones, and make sure that they get justice. Now let's look at the liberal side. So the question is, should the government continue to allow for capital punishment? And the liberal side is no. They're going to argue that A, the death penalty is unconstitutional, that's a violation of human rights, and that it is against international law. The actions used to carry out a death sentence, they would argue, clearly are cruel and unusual. They would argue that shooting a lightning bolt into somebody's head directly, that's cruel and unusual. Breaking somebody's neck, injecting them involuntarily with poisons. These things, they would argue, are cruel and unusual. The U.S. in its history has stood on the principle of defending human rights. It's one of our founding ideas. And killing a human as punishment for a crime, they argue, is a violation of natural rights. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, the first one mentioned is life. And if you are killing people, you are attacking their right to life. 104 countries have banned capital punishment, including most of our allies. Britain, France, Germany. But the countries that still allow it are many countries that we're antagonistic with. North Korea, Iran, China. Do we want to stand with the people in the world who we say often violate human rights, or do we want to stand with the people in the world that say we want to fight alongside you for human rights? And it makes our arguments when we say to countries like Iran or China or North Korea, hey, you have to stop violating human rights. It's messed up. Oh, really? Well, what are you doing? And it makes our arguments against them seem hypocritical. The liberal argument also argued that the death penalty is unnecessary. That's ineffective. It isn't justice. One, they argue it's not a deterrent. There's no way that it's a deterrent. They argue that states that use the death penalty have similar murder rates to those that don't. So it's not like, in Texas where they carry out more executions than any other state that people say, oh, wait, I'm not going to commit that murder because I might, be put to death. No, murders are often crimes of passion. People are not thinking clearly when they happen. Doesn't usually stop and think, oh, what are going to be the legal consequences of this horrible decision taking this person's life? There's no deterrent. There's no factor, or argue the opponents to capital punishment, that's going to make people not want to commit murder if they want to. And they argue the stats show it. They argue that life in prison is a more effective and more just punishment. It forces the murderer to think, to dwell, to face the consequences of their crime day after day, month after month, year after year, for their entire lifespan. And many opponents of capital punishment argue that this is a worse punishment, that putting them to death ends them from having to live with the remorse of what they did, that it's actually letting them off easier. Another argument that is often pointed out is that death sentences have been given to minorities at a far, far higher rate than white criminals for the same crime in the same states. And banning it, many people would argue, ends a form of racial injustice. Lastly, they would point out that the death penalty is not justice. Capital punishment is not justice. It's vengeance. And vengeance is not meant to be the purpose of our court system, of our trial system, of our prison system. It's about justice. They would argue that killing in any form of any person is wrong. They would argue that killing a murderer, and even the worst of murderers, people like Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, will not bring their victims back, will not bring back the lives that were taken. And instead, they argue that using the death penalty continues the cycle of pain from an unjust death. That murderer's loved ones, their family, their parents, their children, their spouses, their community will still feel that same sense of pain, that same sense of loss. You're trading one person's victimhood and pain for another. Death sentences have the same impact on the murderer or the guilty person's family as it does on the victims. Should we be continuing that? The liberals are going to argue no. Last but not least, they're going to point out that if you have a death sentence, it's final. You can't say, oh, take back, we were wrong, sorry. We realize now this new evidence came out, you're innocent, you're free to go. Oh no, you're dead. Death penalties, the death sentence has been given to people who have been later found to be innocent, who have been exonerated. So they would argue that if the government executes an innocent, then the government itself is guilty of murder. Where would it stop then? Should the judge, should the jury who sent that person to capital punishment, should they face the capital punishment now for committing an unjust death? The only way to guarantee an innocent is not executed is to ban capital punishment, argue the liberals. They often will bring up the quote by Gandhi, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. That's capital punishment. Next up will be gun control.